It started as a routine scan, nothing more than that. A team of researchers at Skinwalker Ranch was running standard ground-penetrating equipment across a section of the mesa they had scanned many times before. There was no reason to expect anything unusual. This was the kind of pass they had done dozens of times, part of the slow, ongoing work of mapping what lies beneath the property. And then the readings changed. At first, they thought it was equipment error. A flat, straight shape had appeared in the data, cutting through the rock at a depth no one had mapped before. Straight lines do not occur naturally in solid stone. Water does not carve straight lines. Pressure does not carve straight lines. Straight lines mean something was made. The team ran the scan again, expecting the shape to disappear the way so many strange readings at the ranch had disappeared before. The shape was still there. What they were looking at was not a crack, it was not a natural hollow in the rock, and it was not a shadow in the equipment. It was a tunnel, and it ran deeper than anything previously recorded beneath the ranch. No one on the team said much in that first hour. They just kept checking the numbers, comparing them against old survey data, hoping the equipment was wrong, hoping there was some simple explanation waiting just underneath the confusion. There wasn't. Something had been found beneath Skinwalker Ranch that did not belong there, something with a shape and a structure that should not exist in that kind of rock, at that kind of depth, without an explanation. The team stood over their monitors for a long time that day, saying very little, each of them quietly aware that whatever came next would not be simple. And the people who found it were not ready for what came next. To understand how strange this discovery really is, you have to understand what the ranch has always tried to hide. Skinwalker Ranch has a long, well-documented history of underground anomalies. For years, researchers working the property have reported unusual readings coming from beneath the surface, logged carefully in field notes and survey reports that stretch back well over a decade. Some described faint tunnels appearing in scans, only to vanish when the equipment was run again, leaving nothing behind but a note in a file and a question no one could answer. Others recorded strange electromagnetic activity deep underground, activity that never seemed to have a clear source, spiking without warning and settling just as suddenly. None of it was ever fully confirmed. The readings were often inconsistent. Sometimes they lasted for hours. Sometimes they lasted only minutes before disappearing entirely, leaving the researchers with nothing but their notes and a growing sense that something beneath the mesa was staying just out of reach. Over time, a quiet belief formed among the people who studied the ranch closely. Something exists below the surface, something that instruments cannot fully capture, no matter how advanced the equipment becomes. It was a belief built on years of half-answers and vanishing signals, never quite enough to prove anything, never quite enough to let the question go either. This new discovery was different. The tunnel did not vanish on a second scan, it did not weaken or fade the way earlier signals had. It held steady, consistent, and undeniable, in a way nothing before it ever had. For the first time, the team was not looking at a flicker in the data. They were looking at something solid, something they could measure again and get the same result, which was, in its own way, more unsettling than the earlier vanishing signals had ever been. A signal that disappears can be explained away, a signal that stays cannot be. But nothing in the ranch's history prepared the team for what the new scans actually showed. The equipment used was ground-penetrating radar, paired with a secondary depth sensor designed to measure density changes underground. Both instruments are standard in geological survey work, and both have been used at the ranch for years without producing anything close to this. The first readings showed a passage roughly 6 feet wide, running at a consistent depth with almost no variation. That alone was unusual. Natural cave systems and geological fractures tend to shift in width and depth as they follow the path of least resistance through the rock, widening in soft sections and narrowing in harder ones. This tunnel did not shift. It held its shape, straight and steady, for a distance the scans struggled to fully measure, the readings extending further than the team's equipment range was originally designed to cover. The team's first assumption was a malfunction. Equipment can drift out of calibration. Sensors can misread density in certain soil conditions. So they recalibrated everything, checked every connection, and ran the scan a second time. The result came back the same. Straight walls. Consistent width. A depth that did not waver. Natural formations do not usually behave this way. Water erosion creates curves and irregular shapes. Mineral deposits create pockets, not corridors. Even the slow, grinding movement of shifting rock tends to leave uneven edges and inconsistent width, something the sensors would have easily picked up. None of that was present here. What the scans were showing looked far more like something built than something formed by time and pressure alone. The researchers did not want to say that word out loud yet. It felt too early, too large a claim to make from a set of readings alone. But it was already sitting in the room with them, unspoken, shaping the way every one of them looked at the data. Once the team accepted the tunnel was real, a harder question took its place. How old was it, and who, or what, made it? Dating an underground structure is not simple, and the team knew they had to be careful. There is no single test that can hand over a clean number, especially with a structure this unusual, so they approached the problem from several directions at once. They began by studying the layers of soil and mineral buildup surrounding the tunnel walls, comparing them to known geological timelines for the region. What they found only deepened the confusion. The layering patterns around the tunnel suggested it had existed for a very long time, long enough that natural sediment had settled and hardened around it in ways that normally take centuries. In some sections, mineral deposits had formed along the tunnel's edges, a slow process that requires long, undisturbed periods of time to develop. None of this offered a clear answer. But it strongly suggested one thing: whatever created this tunnel did not do so recently. The evidence pointed toward something built, or formed, long before most of the recorded activity connected to the ranch even began, and possibly long before the property had a name at all. The researchers were careful not to overstate their findings. Soil dating is not exact, and they knew better than to turn early data into a confirmed timeline without more testing. But the possibility was now on the table, openly discussed among the team in a way it hadn't been just days earlier. If the tunnel truly was this old, it meant whatever explanation eventually surfaced would have to account for something far older than anyone at the ranch had expected to find, something that predated most of what had ever been recorded about the property, and possibly predated the property itself in any form we would recognize. Age was only the beginning. What the team found deeper inside raised an even stranger question. As the team extended their scans further into the tunnel, they began focusing on the texture of the walls themselves, running higher resolution imaging in short sections at a time to build a clearer picture. What they found did not match anything typical of natural cave systems in the region. The walls were smooth, unusually smooth, and consistent along nearly the entire length the scans could reach. Natural tunnels formed by water or shifting rock tend to show rough, uneven surfaces, shaped by erosion that moves unevenly over time. The surface held a level consistency that several members of the team struggled to explain using standard geological models. They compared the readings to known tunnel formations elsewhere, both natural and man-made, searching for something that matched, pulling from decades of published geological survey data to see if anything came close. Some formations showed similar smoothness, but only in cases involving specific mineral compositions or unusual pressure conditions, neither of which matched what the soil samples from the ranch suggested. It was the kind of dead end that made the mystery feel deeper rather than closer to being solved. This is where the first real disagreement began. Some researchers leaned toward an explanation involving an unusual, still undetermined natural process, something rare but not impossible, a quirk of mineral composition or pressure they simply hadn't documented before. Others were less convinced, arguing that the consistency was too precise, too deliberate, to be fully explained by geology alone. Voices grew a little firmer during those discussions, notes were compared. Data was re-examined more than once. No one on the team claimed to have the answer. But for the first time since the discovery began, they were openly divided on what they were looking at, and that division was its own kind of warning sign. As the disagreement grew, so did the depth of the tunnel, and depth brought new problems. To reach further into the passage, the team began lowering specialized sensor equipment designed to operate at greater depths than their surface tools could manage, equipment built to handle exactly this kind of environment. That is when the instruments started behaving strangely. Readings that should have remained stable began dropping out entirely, only to return moments later without explanation. Other sensors spiked unexpectedly, registering brief bursts of activity that did not correspond to anything the team could identify, activity with no obvious source, and no repeating rhythm they could predict. It was not a single malfunction. It was a pattern, repeating each time equipment was sent deeper into the tunnel, consistent enough to rule out a simple hardware fault. This kind of interference is not entirely new to Skinwalker Ranch. Electromagnetic anomalies have been documented on the property for years, often in specific, unpredictable locations, appearing without warning and disappearing just as quickly. But this was happening at a depth the team had never tested before, in a structure they had only just confirmed was real, which made the interference feel less like a familiar quirk of the land and more like a direct response to what they were doing. The researchers were honest about what they didn't know. They did not claim to understand the cause, and they resisted the temptation to guess out loud. They simply documented it, adjusting their approach, switching out cables, trying new equipment configurations to get a clearer picture of what was happening below. But the deeper they pushed, the less their instruments seemed willing to cooperate, and that left them with a growing, uncomfortable gap in their understanding, one that no amount of recalibration seemed able to close. With their instruments unreliable, the team had only one option left: go in and see for themselves. Entering the tunnel meant relying on their own senses in a way the scans never required. The team moved carefully, documenting everything as they went, aware that they were now walking through a structure they still did not fully understand, one that had already proven capable of confusing every piece of equipment they had sent ahead of them. The temperature dropped noticeably within the first several yards, more than would be expected from typical underground cooling. The air felt different too, heavier in a way that was hard to describe precisely, though several team members noted it independently, without prompting one another. Sound behaved strangely as well. Voices carried differently the deeper they went, sometimes clearer than expected, sometimes oddly muffled, just a few steps later. None of these details were dramatic on their own. Taken individually, each one had a reasonable explanation, a trick of geology, a quirk of acoustics underground. But together, they created a steady, quiet tension that stayed with the team the entire way in. This was not a horror story unfolding around them. Nothing jumped out from the dark. It was simply the discomfort of being somewhere that did not behave the way experience told them it should, the unsettling feeling of familiar rules quietly failing to apply. Then came something the scans had not shown. The tunnel curved. Gradually at first, then more distinctly, bending in a direction the earlier straight-line readings had never indicated. One of the team later described the moment as the ground quietly telling them their maps were wrong. This contradicted what the team believed they understood about the tunnel's shape, and it forced them to reconsider everything the initial scans had told them, raising the uncomfortable possibility that other parts of the structure had also gone undetected. The curve in the tunnel led somewhere none of them expected. The passage opened into a wider space, and for a moment, no one said anything at all. Headlamps swept across the walls, and the small sounds of breathing and shifting gear were the only things breaking the silence. It was not a natural cavern. The proportions were too even, the shape too intentional, unlike anything typically formed by water or shifting stone. The ceiling rose to a height that felt deliberate, rather than accidental, and the floor, though uneven in places, followed a pattern more consistent than anything the team had documented so far. Along parts of the walls, faint surface markings were visible, patterns that did not immediately match known geological formations or any documented human construction in the region. The team moved slowly, documenting everything with careful, methodical precision, taking measurements, photographs, and samples exactly the way their training told them to, working section by section around the chamber so nothing would be missed or overlooked in the moment. On camera, their language stayed measured and professional, focused entirely on description rather than speculation, the habits of careful scientists holding firm even in an unfamiliar space. But privately, several team members later admitted that in that moment, none of them had a clear framework for what they were looking at. It did not match anything from their training. It did not match anything from the ranch's known history either. For a long moment, the only sound in the chamber was the quiet clicking of equipment and their own careful footsteps. This was the moment the entire investigation had been building toward, the point where a strange scan and a stranger tunnel became something undeniably real and physically present. Whatever explanation eventually emerged, the chamber itself was no longer in question. It existed, and it was unlike anything previously confirmed beneath the ranch. Finding the chamber answered one question, it immediately created three more. Back at their equipment, the team began analyzing the markings found along the chamber walls, comparing them to other anomalies previously documented at the ranch. No clean match emerged. Several theories were discussed, each one carefully framed as exactly that, a theory, not a conclusion. Some researchers suggested the markings could be the result of unusual geological pressure over an extremely long period, a slow natural process capable of producing patterns that only appeared deliberate to the human eye. It was a reasonable idea, one grounded in known science, and for a while it seemed like the most likely explanation on the table. Others raised the possibility of unknown historical activity in the region, activity that left no trace anywhere else on the ranch, no records, no artifacts, nothing beyond this single chamber. That theory was harder to test, and harder to dismiss. A few team members were hesitant to offer any theory at all, unwilling to speculate further without more evidence. Preferring to sit with the uncertainty rather than fill it with a guess they weren't confident in. What stood out was not any single explanation, but the fact that no explanation fully accounted for everything they had found. Each theory solved part of the puzzle while leaving other details unresolved. The markings, the smooth walls, the age of the tunnel, the sensor interference, none of it fit neatly into one clean answer. Put the pieces together, and something didn't add up, and that gap, more than any single detail, was what kept the team up at night. No theory fully explained what they found. And then the deeper scans revealed something that changed the entire investigation. Extended equipment eventually picked up something the team had not anticipated. Branching off from the chamber was a second passage, smaller than the main tunnel, continuing beyond the current reach of their instruments. It was almost missed entirely, tucked into a shadowed section of the chamber wall that early scans had passed over, only noticed once the team began a more careful, section-by-section review of every surface. This changed how the team understood the entire discovery. The tunnel and the chamber were not necessarily the end of the structure. They may have only been its entrance, the first visible piece of something considerably larger still hidden beneath the mesa, waiting in the dark beyond the reach of any equipment they currently had on site. The researchers approached this new information carefully, unwilling to overstate what it might mean before gathering more data. There was a natural pull toward excitement, toward assuming the biggest possible answer, and the team pushed back against that instinct as best they could. But the implications were difficult to ignore. If the structure extended further than currently known, then everything documented so far, the tunnel, the chamber, the markings, represented only a portion of whatever exists beneath the ranch. A first chapter in a story none of them could yet see the shape of. For now, that passage remains unexplored, and that unfinished truth may be the most important part of this discovery. Stepping back from the immediate findings, researchers began considering what this discovery means for the broader understanding of Skinwalker Ranch as a whole, taking time away from the tunnel itself to think through the larger picture. For decades, the ranch has produced anomalies that resist easy explanation, readings and reports that never quite added up to a complete picture, stories and sensor data that hinted at something without ever fully confirming it. This tunnel, and the chamber connected to it, may represent the most physically substantial evidence yet tied to that long pattern. It is not a flicker in the data, or a signal that vanished before it could be studied. It is a structure that exists, one that can be walked through, measured, and documented directly, something future researchers will be able to return to again and again. The researchers involved have been careful to treat the discovery with the seriousness it deserves, avoiding premature conclusions while acknowledging its significance. They know how easy it would be to overstate a finding like this, and how much harder it is to do the slow, careful work of actually understanding it. Whatever the eventual explanation turns out to be, this finding is now considered one of the most important pieces of physical evidence connected to the ranch's long, unresolved history, a discovery that may end up reshaping how the entire property is studied going forward. But even with everything they now know, one question remains louder than all the others. What lies at the end of that second passage? It is a simple question, but it is the one no one on the team has been able to answer, and it is the one that has stayed with each of them long after they left the chamber behind. That question remains unanswered for now, and it may stay that way for some time. Skinwalker Ranch has once again produced something that does not fit neatly into existing explanations. Something that raises more questions than it resolves. The tunnel exists. The chamber exists. The second passage exists, extending into the dark, beyond where current equipment can follow, waiting for the day the team has the tools and the answers ready to go further. Whether true or not, what happened beneath that mesa only deepens a mystery that has followed this land for decades. To this day, no clear answer exists for what researchers found, or for what may still be waiting further along that unexplored passage, and every attempt so far to close that gap has only opened new ones. According to those close to the investigation, plans are already being discussed to return, better equipped and better prepared, though no one is willing to say what they expect to find, or how far they are prepared to go to find it. Some places do not give up their answers easily. Skinwalker Ranch may be one of them, and this discovery may only be the beginning of a much larger investigation still unfolding beneath its surface. For now, the tunnel stays where it has likely stayed for a very long time, quiet, unexplained, and waiting.